All right, Daniel, if you can turn on your video, that would be great. There you are. Hi.
Hi, guys.
Hello.
How are you?
Good. How are you?
Good. We are right on time, everybody. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. This is Andrew Shapiro from Broadscale Group. I'm really delighted to have two terrific guests for our session today on the future of cities and transportation. I'm going to introduce them in just a moment. I want to thank our friends at Nexus Israel for co-hosting this session with us. We've got a really remarkable audience of innovators, investors, entrepreneurs, and other interested folks in the future, as well as the Broadscale corporate network and many of our family office network members as well. Let's see. Can you guys hear me okay? Let me just change. 1 second. Okay. Can you guys hear me now?
Yeah.
We're all doing wonders of Zoom here. See, is this internet connection a little better? Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry for that. I think I've got a better connection here. I can hear you, Daniel. Are you all right?
Yeah, I can hear you, Andrew, but you're sort of cutting in and out, unfortunately.
Okay. I just switched internet. Work better. I was having some technical difficulties on my side. All right, I think you guys can hear me now. And I hope everybody else can as well. We've got a number of attendees on the list. And let me say at the outset, for folks who want to ask questions, there is a Q&A button on the bottom of your Zoom screen toward the right. Please put your questions in there and we will get them to Greg and to Daniel. You know, I want to give a quick background on each of them. Greg Lindsay is Director of Strategy for CoMotion, which is an offshoot of New Cities, a think tank based in Canada. He's the Director of Applied Research at New Cities. He's also a journalist and an author, wrote the book Aerotropolis, The Way We'll Live Next. We're really delighted to have you with us, Greg. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I can see you there. Good. And then Daniel Ramot, my friend and the CEO of Via. Many of you know Via, the shared ride software company, also working around the world on helping cities to make public transit better, and obviously in a really interesting place with the changes that are happening in cities and transportation right now. So we're really delighted to have both of you with us. And as I said, we're glad to be co-hosting this with Nexus Israel and having so many of you on. So I'm going to get started by asking you, Greg, if you could, help us with the broader landscape of understanding how you think cities will be transformed by the COVID-19 crisis and, frankly, the economic dislocation that's going to occur. And I think it's important that we start this session by recognizing the very, very significant turmoil that is underway in the United States right now in urban areas as a result of the terrible events of the last week, and we want to be mindful of that and cognizant of it. And I think that's another factor playing into the future of our city life, and we want to be mindful of that as well. But how do you see changes happening in terms of patterns of how people will work and commute and use public transit, where they will decide to live, and also what are the opportunities for innovation and change that could come? Whether it's, I know you've been tracking different cities and how they're using public streets and trying to encourage more use of sustainable and innovative transportation. So wondering if you can kick things off and then we'll dig in deeper.
I was going to say, we can't get much more expansive than the opening question here, but I'll do my best. I mean, yeah, certainly. I mean, we're talking about what's about to happen after, certainly not a black swan, a white swan event. We always knew a pandemic would happen, likely. It was just a question of timing. And obviously, its disruptions to cities and the economy have been massive. So, I mean, the very honest answer to your question is it's really hard to predict what will happen when the situation is changing moment by moment. But, we have 20% unemployment in the United States. There's not much hope of further relief packages on the immediate horizon. We have, America's, of course, racial legacy has led to what can be best described as an uprising across much of the country right now, certainly exasperated by some of the economic pressures. So let's acknowledge that at the outset, as you said, but then looking forward from there is, I mean, yeah, we have all sorts of interesting conventional wisdoms forming, right? The office is dead. We're never going to work from offices again. I would take some issue with that in terms of, particularly when it comes to longer run issues about how do we innovate, how do we collaborate? I mean, we can continue, and we have been running much of the American economy for 3 months via Zoom calls and Slack, and it shows the resilience of that. And I do think we'll see, that the culture of presenteeism in American corporations has been broken. We are now, we are on the cusp of an unprecedented opportunity to rethink what hybrid organizations should be, how work should best be done, and by whom and in what medium. So there's an opportunity there. I don't think we should begin throwing out our office towers yet, even though we hear from various CEOs and, whether it's the big banks like Morgan Stanley and Barclays about we don't need our offices anymore, or Facebook, announcing you can work from home forever, but we're going to cut your pay if you move out of the state of California, and various issues like that. But there's something definitely there. The second part you mentioned is, mobility trends. And, for those of you who follow Apple mobility trends or Waze data, you can see that, for every country in which there are lockdowns, we've seen precipitous declines in walking, driving, and public transit, with transit falling the farthest. And in the United States, we've seen that driving is already recovering to pre-COVID levels, while transit is somewhere around 65% below the norm. Now, this is worrisome for all sorts of reasons. One, we know that dead cities can't effectively survive without transit. Jeff Tumlin in San Francisco, for example, has said that simply due to geometry, we cannot have the entire San Francisco workforce drive to work. It won't happen. We also know that, ironically, according to evidence out of Tokyo, that basically public transport does not necessarily spread the virus if you wear a mask and you observe the norms. But, we run the risk here of, public transit, which has been in decline of ridership for the second half of the last decade, could experience permanent depressed declines. And Daniel could talk a bit about this, about some of the opportunities there that we have to basically recreate our transit networks from scratch, the ones that at least aren't hardwired in the form of metros, and think about this opportunity to redesign that. But my fear, of course, is that we'll see, the so-called flight to the suburbs or flight beyond, another one of the conventional wisdoms, which the CEO of Zillow just said yesterday, that even though he doesn't expect, that we're going to see a mass migration back to the office, they're not seeing any signs so far of people fleeing cities for suburbs. They're seeing a lot of disfaction. A lot of people are rethinking where they want to live and how right now based on the volume of searches they're seeing, but they're not seeing the sort of wholesale flight. So I mean, when it comes to opportunities, I like to think that, we're going to hopefully rethink our public realm, open up streets to other uses, whether that's pedestrians, whether that's micromobility, which we can talk a bit about, whether that's moving businesses outside like restaurants and retail, opening up the public realm to a safer area. And also, again, thinking about where we should work, if not from central city offices, perhaps from third place workspaces closer to our homes, places where we can get away from our families that we spent the last few months with, but work in a place that doesn't require as long a commute. So I could keep going, but I'd like to pass off to Daniel there in terms of what they're seeing, because I do think, honestly, that VIA is poised to be one of the big winners of this, given that we have this opportunity to basically remap our entire transit networks. And I know you guys are pushing into that. Sorry, I'm moderating my other panelists.
No. That's excellent. Thank you, Greg. Great opening. And let me turn it to you, Daniel, by also saying, I didn't say in the introduction, disclosure, we're an investor in VIA and obviously have been tracking closely what you're doing. And I think you guys are providing an inspiring example of a technology company that is quickly and agilely adapting to this circumstance. And maybe you'd be able to talk a little bit about some of the things. I know there was a report in the New York Times last week about ways in which you're helping cities to reimagine and rethink opening their public transit, and that'd be great to hear about. But even, I think from the very first days of the pandemic, your municipal partners came to you and said, look, we can't do shared rides. the way we usually do, but could you help us move essential workers and goods? And that's another thing would be great to hear from. So I'll turn it over to you to kind of talk about how you see things changing as a result of COVID.
Thanks so much, Andrew and Greg. That's a great intro into some of the stuff we've been thinking about. Andrew, I think that's exactly right. I think one thing we saw when the pandemic hit is that the cities that we work with, who we provide either software or transit services to around the world, those cities that had a VIA system could much more quickly adapt to the challenges that the crisis presented and shift to using these more flexible systems to efficiently move essential workers, health workers, and in some cases, which is something we had not been doing before, but immediately sort of work to support cities with, is delivering all sorts of essential goods, in particular meals, but in some cases even diapers and formula to families and kids and elderly folks who could not leave their houses or who were used to getting their meals at schools and were no longer going to schools. So the needs changed very quickly. And that obviously created an opportunity on our side to be supportive. I don't want to say that those essential services are necessarily a long-term fantastic business, but at least in the short term, they allow us to support our partners and support cities and do something for the communities that were suffering from COVID. In the longer term, I think Greg is absolutely right. What we see is there's definitely going to be a challenge in getting people back to transit. So I think you've got sort of competing both challenges and opportunities. Greg, I think, covered many of them. People are going to be reluctant to come back to public transportation, whether that's right or wrong, certainly without any understanding of whether capacity on those vehicles, large vehicles, is going to be effectively managed, or whether they're going to find themselves on a crowded subway car or a crowded bus. So there's going to be reluctance to use public transit. I think cities, are going to find their budgets are stretched, cities, municipalities, and public transit agencies. So that's going to be a real tough challenge in sort of supporting and reinforcing public transit systems. On the flip side, I think we really need public transit in order to recover from this crisis. I think people are going to, just like cities, they're going to find their wallets are really tight, and buying a car or driving and paying for parking may be extremely difficult for many people. And if we're going to revive our cities and revive our urban environments and our economies, I think we're really going to need alternative modes of transit that are not just private taxis or ride hail or driving yourself. And so we really believe public transit has an important role to play in the recovery. And long term, hopefully the pandemic is behind us and people come back en masse. But in the short term, we need to implement safety measures. We're thinking about capacity management systems on every kind of vehicle, including fixed route buses. We're working with agencies to implement reservations. I know it sounds kind of strange, but reservation systems for buses so that people can know they can get on the bus and feel safe. And then we're looking at, the last point I'll make, Greg, exactly, I think the key opportunity is redesigning the network, because what we were seeing in 2017, maybe as far back, 2012, we started the company, no one in transit wanted to talk to us about redesigning their network with more flexible or dynamic technology. 2017, 5 years later, people were open to the conversation, but it was very hard. Over the last 6 to 12 months, it's become very mainstream to introduce on-demand dynamic routing into your network, but it was still a small piece. It was an island within a larger transit network. And because the feeling was the existing transit network generally worked, maybe there's some small pieces we could fix with more technology. Today, I think the realization is very clear. The existing fixed route transit network is finding it extremely difficult to adapt to COVID and work. And so we need to change it. And if we're going to change it, then maybe this is the time to think a little differently about how to change it. Going from a weekday to a weekend schedule every day, that's a change. It doesn't really work in the context of completely altered demand patterns during COVID and completely altered sort of dynamics within the city and needs within the city. So there's a real opportunity, and I'm finding that transit agency CEOs and mayors and leaders of transit across the US in particular are very open to having this conversation and saying, okay, let's rethink the network. What does that mean?
And Greg, maybe you at a macro level can talk a little bit. What were the vulnerabilities that essentially this crisis exposed, right? I mean, in terms of some of the issues that Daniel just mentioned, but and obviously some of the advocacy work that you've been doing at your think tank and in your writing, were for better solutions for cities. Do you think that this could turn into one of those kind of, crisis is a terrible thing to waste opportunities where, we actually accelerate some of the trends towards a more resilient and sustainable public transit system, and maybe equitable as well?
Well, I mean, certainly let's hope. I mean, yeah, I mean, I'm certainly among those calling for, a green stimulus package. It's been discussed widespread that, that there's all sorts of opportunities here to think about how we could decarbonize transport, the switch to electric vehicles, whether that's incentives for cars, of course, or for buses, electric busing. There's, a whole opportunity here, as Daniel said, to rethink what the networks can be. When it comes to equity, I mean, this goes back to the point of cities like New York, where I lived for 20 years. I mean, the entire bus networks are designed to basically funnel people into Manhattan. And there's, very few opportunities to get people through the outer boroughs where communities of color live, which have been some of the hardest hit communities like Elmhurst and Corona from COVID-19. So, there's a huge opportunity to actually think about how our cities have developed and how we can reconnect them to jobs. I think there's an off-cited Brookings report, for example, that only 30% of jobs in a given metro are actually reachable by public transit in under 90 minutes. I mean, that's just shocking, and it cuts to the heart of what cities are for, which is to become these, huge agglomeration engines to give people jobs and opportunity, and they don't do that. You basically place a tax on people if they don't have a car or other ways of getting around. So yeah, there's obviously a way to rethink this with the subsidies, whether that's the $25 billion the feds have already assigned to public transport, or other opportunities. And and we're starting to see, in various forms, these kinds of new partnerships and new opportunities spring up. So one example, and this is where I will plug upcoming CoMotion Miami Live, which we're doing June 30th and July 1st with Alice Bravo from Miami-Dade. She started an interesting public-private partnership with Uber in that case, where they are providing overnight service and offering it free to essential workers. So we're seeing cities and governments like Miami-Dade are now coming to the private companies on more favorable terms when it comes to partnerships there. Another example of this, I think, of opportunities is we spent the last decade, right, watching the public and private sectors fight over this. Uber, Lyft, Via is actually relatively one of the exceptions here, but lots of well-funded private entities wrestling with cities to set partnerships on their terms. And now, of course, with the various fiscal apocalypses happening, the cities are coming back because, of course, they have government funding and saying, no, you're actually going to work with us on our terms now. And micromobility, which we can get into in more depth, I think is one interesting example there, where we've discussed at CoMotion with people that one path forward for micromobility is not as carpet bombing streets with scooters, but now working more closely with the public sector to provide that essential service that is necessary after core trunk routes of public transit are rendered inoperable for at least the time being. And so, will we see these private companies become closer to becoming vendors versus disruptors? That's something I'm very hopeful about, that we could finally see this marriage of new technology and public policy goals and hopefully fulfill those. So that's one opportunity that springs to mind, particularly with the whole sort of streets revolution that we're seeing in various cities, where they're realizing we should be taking street space from cars and opening up these other uses to increase throughput. And that's, again, where there's tremendous opportunities to work with the private sector.
Daniel, what do you think is the potential for accelerating some of these trends like intermodal or multimodal transit, so that people can solve the first mile, last mile problem that people have been working on for a long time, which is as Greg said, the existing public transit systems being fixed route and inflexible don't usually solve that. How do you think, you're a technology company at heart, a software company. There are a lot of people in the software and data space who are trying to kind of create those linkages. Do you think there's more potential for that now?
Yeah, Andrew, I really do. I think when you look at how transit is structured, and I'll talk about the U.S., obviously the rest of the world, some parts of the world operate quite differently, but in the U.S., a lot of times you see different parts of the transit system that are funded by taxpayers, whether it's federal funding or more state, local funding. They're very distinct from one another. So you've got the fixed bus route network, then you've got the paratransit network. Then sometimes you've got what used to be called dial-a-ride, and now we're adding on demand to it. We have micromobility systems operated by private enterprises, and these systems are very rarely integrated. And then you have a lot of different stakeholders who have got very different opinions. So one thing that we ran into, for example, in thinking about, okay, if you're going to really be able to integrate all of this, and certainly if you're going to run this crazy idea of having a reservation system for seats on a bus, you need to put a device on the bus that alerts the drivers to who can get on and who can get off. And the first thing we ran into was a labor concern from labor unions saying, this is not part of my job. This is, if we're going to put another device, we need to rethink the collective bargaining agreement, right? And there was a lot of opposition. When in fact, once you start speaking to the unions and to the drivers, it's very maybe counterintuitive, but it's immediately obvious that the person most at risk of overcrowding on the bus is actually the driver. So it really should be the drivers and the unions who are saying, I do not want to drive this bus. And if you've seen some of the stories out of Detroit and other places where transit transit operators are the ones becoming sick and disproportionately impacted by this, it really should be coming from. So I think there's a conversation to be had that under normal times, because of the way these different stakeholders think and operate and the history that they had, has been extremely difficult to try to coordinate across modes. But during COVID, all of a sudden there's a bit more of an openness to say, okay, I know that the union is in a dispute with the transit agency, and they depending on which side you're talking to, fair requests around pay and so forth. But this should, we should also work together on this front and try to improve conditions and improve the system for everyone. So in many maybe unpredictable ways, I think there are opportunities being created by this crisis that I hope we don't miss, as we don't waste this opportunity to improve the system.
And what about micromobility, Greg? You've mentioned it, and we know as New Yorkers is a new service that actually I think took a different approach. Larger format vehicles, Revel, which are electric mopeds, and they actually got, I think, an expedited license from the city to expand to help healthcare workers move around. I mean, are you seeing some of the other players in the micromobility market try to work more closely now with cities and government rather than the initial strategy, which was, as you said, sort of let's put a lot of scooters on sidewalks and see if people trip over them?
I haven't seen anything definitive, and I could be corrected here about whether we're seeing a massive integration with public agencies kind of thing. But yeah, there have been some interesting efforts, and we've seen companies like Lime and others have offered making their service available to essential workers. I'll be curious to see how that evolves. Like I said, there's a couple paths forward, I think, for micromobility. One is which they get closer to the public sector and they plug into existing systems and networks and provide that sort of that gap filling capacity. Another one is that we see micromobility evolve from here into the private vehicle space, right, where the norm becomes you simply buy your own. Italy, for example, has made a €500 credit for lightweight electric vehicles, scooters, bicycles, etc. We know e-bike sales are soaring, admittedly from a very small base in the United States, but they are soaring as they have been in Europe for several years now. And we're seeing luxury vehicles come out there. Van Moof, they've made this gorgeous electric bike, which just raised $15 million to expand capacity. So perhaps it ends up looking like the auto market in some ways, where you have your average get around scooter, and then you have deluxe luxury vehicles with all the status you accrue from that. Another model forward is what Spin's trying to do with their sort of corporate real estate hubs, where they're going to property owners and basically offering docked scooters as an amenity to that. And we could see micromobility just get incorporated into that. And that's what I would encourage to employers, for example. It's very disheartening to see the CDC guidelines say don't take public transit, and employers should consider giving free parking back to employees. I mean, just the signal that sends. I'd rather see for example, micromobility become part of commuter plans, where they're offering memberships and things like this to help get around. So I don't know. It'll be interesting to see how that evolves. And yeah, and then going forward, we're going to see this continued evolution at very high speed of vehicle typologies. And I think one of the things that we underestimate today is the specialization and variations that are going to occur. Electric cargo bikes, for example, for deliveries in cities. If delivery is a trend that's truly here to stay, which I think it is to some extent. We've already seen tremendous destruction to retail in cities. I mean, there's going to be obviously this huge die-off and of small businesses, where we're seeing, large technology platforms, the so-called stacks, are now building out, ghost restaurants and dark kitchens and all this terminology there. We'll see an uptick in delivery that can be done through electric vehicle types and all sorts of sort of new profusions there. So yeah, this could be a sort of not to get too biological analogy, but a sort of die-off of a particular early species of micromobility, and then lead to a sort of another Cambrian explosion of new life forms as they evolve into the various needs to fulfill for various entities. I could see that.
And Daniel, what about you guys? I mean, I know you've done a few experiments, kind of partnering with different parts of the mobility landscape, including micro. How do you see things going forward for different form factors?
Yeah, I think, Andrew, I don't know that we are experts in micromobility. We've looked at it a few times. We thought about running our own micromobility service on behalf of cities, adding to our offering to cities. the economics, at least at the time, were tough, and so it didn't feel like something that we wanted to invest in. But I do think that the integration, you're thinking about a first last mile problem that involves multiple modes that eventually connect you to a fixed route, a high throughput, high speed fixed route mode, I think is one of the most efficient ways to think about the network. And to me, micromobility, whether it's privately owned scooter or bike or a shared one, has a lot of potential and should be part of the system. And again, it would, I think the biggest potential is if you as a user have a very easy way to see all of your options when you wake up in the morning, that opens up, I think, a lot of opportunity to create a much more efficient network.
We have a question. I want to encourage people to submit their questions in the Q&A section. We already have a few here from one of our corporate venture capital partners about, do you guys see a relationship between micromobility and the bigger kind of energy transition? Most micromobility devices are electric, but will they have a significant impact on reducing pollution in cities and congestion, that kind of thing? Maybe the converse I'd add is there a substantial public health benefit, which I think has been hinted at already. So curious if you guys have a take on that. Maybe Greg.
Sure, I'll go first. Yeah, the obvious upshot, like you said, is the public health aspect, right? I mean, first off, it appears to be consensus now that as long as you're outdoors, moving through space, you're much less likely to catch the virus. So certainly we can use the public health aspect as a lever to get people on, if they're going to have personal mobility, to have these lighter weight forms of personal mobility. And then second, obviously, when the International Energy Agency says that the transition from sedans to SUVs was the second largest source of growth in carbon emissions over the last decade, anything to get people out of SUVs onto micromobility will have a better effect on both air pollution and climate change. So I think we'll see that. I will defer to the various charging network companies of the world and others who are looking at how best to implement that municipal charging infrastructure and how best to arrange that. And again, it comes back to some of the business models here, or municipal models about do you have municipal fleets that are charged? Do you offer as amenity where it can be charged in apartment buildings or offices overnight, kind of thing like that? I think that all remains to be seen. But yeah, again, this is where I defer to some of the micromobility guys out there. But they're seeing potential huge savings on this, and and it's interesting to see people like Michael Lieberick of Bloomberg New Energy Finance arguing that this crisis and economic depression leading to a crash in oil prices, the inversion of April, will actually accelerate this trend towards green, because again, we'll see these stimulus packages in Japan, Western Europe, and the United States could well be left behind in this because of the efforts by various auto industry interests to roll back fuel emissions. So I think that transition will definitely happen in the rest of the world. It could happen more slowly here, but as we all know, the economics of clean energy just make too much sense to try to hold on forever.
Daniel, we have a question here also about how some of these dynamics about COVID and transportation will play out, not just in the urban core, but in suburban areas and less dense cities, and even specific use cases like campuses or resort areas or airports. How do you see that happening, and frankly also the role for software like yours in these other use cases for transit?
Yeah, so I think maybe it's worth thinking also about how, when you're thinking about different geographies, how this is playing out in different parts of the world. I would say we see, to the extent it's interesting to folks on this call, we see some pretty interesting different dynamics in different parts of the world. Even within Europe, you see, in the UK, where most of the bus operations are essentially outsourced to private companies. Those private companies are really struggling and basically being bailed out by the taxpayer. And that is an opportunity to create some change. So in Wales, for example, we have a partnership with Transport for Wales, where they're conditioning some of these funds that are being provided to the bus operators in integrating their services into a technology system that we're providing that makes those routes much more dynamic in real time based on actual demand as the COVID crisis is evolving. So there's an interesting opportunity there, and a recognition that the networks have to change, and the transit agencies are getting involved in doing some of that. We're also seeing the bus companies themselves, who are private companies that need to be profitable, thinking long term. Okay, how are we going to make this transition, post-COVID, many of the way that the bus networks in the UK often work is that very high capacity routes are subsidizing the lower capacity routes and allowing these companies to still on the whole remain profitable. There's a recognition that those high capacity routes for a long time are not going to be back to their original high capacity. So where's the money going to come from to fund the entire network? Do they need to cut services in the lower capacity routes? And so thinking about how do we make that network much more responsive instead of running a fixed route bus every hour, every day on this route that's low capacity, could we replace 3 routes with one dynamic van that's running around picking people up? So, UK is one area where we're really seeing some potential for change. I'd say, interestingly, in the Persian Gulf, some of the states there that we're working with are extremely advanced. We're seeing places where they're moving forward to replace entire bus networks, dozens, if not hundreds of buses, at least overnight where demand is much lower, with dynamic systems that, we have a case where we can, with a few tens of dynamic vans, provide better quality of service than what you're getting out of a 200 bus network, at least overnight. And, we can show that very clearly in simulations and hopefully very soon on the ground. So a lot of interest in that. And then there's some parts of the world, like I see in some parts of Germany, where they're just back and they're saying, COVID is not really an issue. We're operating 100%. Public transit is great. We don't need to make any changes. It's fantastic. And so a very, very different kind of range of opinions across the world. And I think the same thing applies when you're thinking, in the dense urban core, they're going to be dynamic where a lot more people are going to drive. I think I heard a stat from the commissioner of the DOT here in New York saying that if 10% of the folks who are typically commuting into Manhattan by public transit chose to drive instead, it would actually triple the car load in Manhattan. So 200% increase in car load. So that's an enormous car load to think about and congestion issue. So dense urban cores are facing one kind of challenge. And then in suburban environments, I think we have a different kind of challenge where it's very hard to solve that with fixed route buses, always has been. But perhaps micromobility or solutions that are far more dynamic, smaller form factors, more on demand, could actually be good solutions for introducing public transportation in those regions.
And Daniel, a quick follow-up based on a question we just got here. The experiment that you were talking about working with a city on some kind of reservation system for buses, this person asked, could that work in New York, where she said that there might be a system where even the subway would require, some kind of toll gating to know how many people are going to get on the subway, and there might be times where you'd check an app and the subway would tell you the subway's overcrowded, so you have to get a reservation on the bus. I mean, have you heard anything like that? And then I guess I'll add, since I know this, you guys have a very innovative contract with the Department of Education in New York City to use your software to manage all the New York City school buses. It's like 10,000 buses. What are you hearing from them about reopening school and using school buses, and how are they going to handle that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I can just say that for my part, I hope they reopen schools real fast, because I love my 3 kids to be back in schools, and I love them. I'm not saying anything about that, but it would be great. I think the reservation system, is just something we can talk about that for a second, and how it would apply to New York is tricky because of the behavioral change that it requires. So we don't think of a bus the way we think of a movie theater. You show up to a movie theater and all the seats are sold. You don't throw a tantrum and just march into the movie theater saying it's your God-given right to watch that movie at that time. You come back when there's a seat. People don't think about the bus that way. They think about the bus, they show up and they expect to board. And if they can't board, that's a real issue from their perspective. And so I think there's a fundamental behavioral change that you need to think about. And then, do you ask the driver to be the arbiter of who gets on or not, or do you put an attendant in the bus stop? That's obviously an additional cost. So there's some real changes that will be required. Having said that, I think, and if COVID, hopefully this is the case, on June 8th, we start to reopen New York City, and it turns out that COVID, is mostly behind us. So I think this becomes a non-issue. But if that's not the case, and I can speak to at least what we see in Israel, where there are definitely the reopening has led to some recurring waves of infection. I don't know if the waves is the right, the clusters of infection, and what is the right way to deal with that is still very unclear. If COVID is going to be with us for a while and we want people to come back to the transit system, then it's probably worth investing in trying to adapt behavior over time. It's going to take time so people understand they have to reserve a seat. Now, you can't only do that through a smartphone app because there's a real equity question. So how do people who don't have a smartphone app do that? So, you have to be able to provide a call, a number that you can call, a web portal. We have a system where you can actually text, there's a code and a number published on every bus stop. You just text that code in to that number. The system knows that there's a person who wants to get picked up at that stop. So there are many ways to do it that hopefully will be sufficiently accessible to everyone and make that equitable. It's a real investment, not just in the technology and the transformation, but it's there's a change management across the user that is pretty difficult, I think, to do. Having said that, if you can do that, you could probably also do that for a train. A train is actually much easier than a bus. It's much more predictable. It's much easier to kind of plan, but enforcing it on a system the scale of the New York City subway is a massive challenge. So I think it's not, the technology is not magic. It's not just going to solve the problem. I think there's sort of a collaboration, working together with the transit agency, with the riders, having people understand that in the end it's for their own benefit. And again, it's only relevant if we're facing this crisis for an enhanced period of time. But I think it's important to think about at least and start to experiment with.
I could just quickly follow up on Daniel's comments there. It's instructive to mention the Beijing metro example where they are doing the reservations. So there in China, you have in Hangzhou, where the government has proposed making the sort of, the health QR codes where you have a health status as part of your credit score. I mean, the proposal to make that permanent was met with instant outrage by citizens, even in China, where this is sort of accepted, of course, as part of the party. So let's imagine, the other issues that are raised by this, the potential, what I don't want to see in the United States is this increasing surveillance in the name of health safety. On top of this, I mean, given the unrest in the United States right now, I think it's fair to say that many of those protesters would be very wary, rightfully or wrongly, of Daniel's involvement of, registering their presence on a bus and registering their presence constantly to access public services. There's, of course, equity issues with this and all sorts of civil liberty issues of this in terms of what data is being collected by whom. So, it'll be interesting to see if that behavior change would even be possible in the United States, particularly in this kind of moment. And then also we always need to be cognizant about what are the second and third order effects of where that data goes and who can look at it. I should just mention at this point, for example, that Zoom today announced that public calls will not be encrypted because they want to hand that over to law enforcement. So hello to the NYPD. We'll go on to the next question from there.
We'll watch out for what we say here, Greg. I think the privacy point is an excellent one. I just want to say I think there's always this really tough balance between the convenience and the efficiency that technology provides with the it all comes with data, right? A lot of the value in that is in the data, and then once you've got the data, then you've got privacy questions that spring up. So I totally agree. I will say one thing is that if you do end up introducing through this reservation system technology onto buses in particular, but maybe also trains, while you created a potential privacy and data problem, which can be addressed, I hope, you also create the potential to then make those modes instantly more flexible and more dynamic. And that doesn't mean they have to change their route, but you could, once you have a reservation system, you don't have to send the bus every 15 or 30 minutes. You can just send the bus as needed and make that system sort of dramatically more efficient. So there's sort of opportunities and risks, I think, on both sides with something like this.
Yeah, and just another quick follow-up, a more serious answer this time in some ways, is exactly this debate has been played out in Los Angeles, where LADOT developed their own data specification to track micromobility and push instructions on how it can use the public realm. And of course, Uber has fought back now in federal court. And, and there's, of course, all sorts of privacy arguments here. You see Uber and the Electronic Frontier Foundation on the same side, with the EFF arguing that data can be handed over to the LAPD. LADOT argued that would never happen. They don't do it already, but you can obviously see why people have concerns. And this will happen too. If driving becomes more prevalent, we're going to see more cities adopt congestion pricing. And that technology, of course, is refined. There's a startup out of New York called ClearRoad. There's, of course, Cord that came out of Sidewalk Labs to control curb space. We're going to see the city made more legible in response to that, to basically fight back against cars and try to control that domain. So that's an ongoing, privacy, governance, private sector battle that will probably only get more heated after this.
We have a question. We only have about 6 minutes left because we're going to have to end on time, but quick one for you guys on autonomous. Do you see impacts on the rise of autonomous coming from this, maybe again with the public health angle? Autonomous vehicles.
So I can take a crack at that. I think, Greg, I'm actually very curious to hear your thoughts. I don't know that this, we haven't seen a lot of input saying that there, people are worried about sharing with the driver and therefore sort of demanding autonomous vehicles. It's also fairly easy to, which is something we're doing across all the vehicles that we sort of have access to in any municipal service, installing partitions between the driver and the passenger. So that's reasonably easily solved, I think, from that perspective. I suspect actually that there's, the funding situation is less favorable for autonomous vehicles at the moment than perhaps it was pre-crisis. So that may have an impact on slowing things down. And either way, I'm not sure they're that close anyway. So that's a separate topic. I'll leave it to
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is I've long been a bit bearish on autonomous vehicles per se in terms of the complexity and safety issues involved, and that sort of conventional wisdom has come around that it's proving ever harder, Zeno's paradox style, to actually achieve that. But I do think, and it'll be interesting to see, because as Daniel pointed out, there's a lot of things we can do here with humans that are protected versus having to turn it over to robots and automation for this. But we could easily see, that, the urge towards sanitizable surfaces and lack of human contact for health safety could lead to a push to more autonomous delivery services. And so that's the trend I'm sort of following here about, will we see increased deployment of automation to that end? We've got Starship and Milton Keynes in the UK. We've seen, for example, we're having an upcoming episode of CoMotion Live. We're going to have Neolix, which is a Chinese startup that's building specialized delivery. Neuro, which has ex-Waymo and $1 billion in funding. They're just going to deal with CVS to do pharmaceutical deliveries. So I think this could be a fresh bout of wind, a fresh gust of wind into the sails of those that are focused more on delivery of services and
more
goods.
of delivery of goods. Yeah.
Versus
really
that, because the safety issues are easier to solve. You don't have to do it in a mixed traffic environment. So that could be interesting to follow.
Autonomous drones more. So in the 4 minutes we have left, I want to let you each kind of go back up a level to the bigger picture about how you see the future of cities emerging. One of the key points that I know you both care about is that cities over the last 2 decades, not only have we reached the tipping point where most people live in cities, but cities have become the hubs of innovation, growth, great ideas, culture. And do we see that continuing in a post-COVID environment? Because that's the thing that makes cities wonderful and vibrant and attractive to all of us to live in. Downtown, urban core, the heart of cities. Or do we see, a different view that edge cities or external areas away from the urban core, people are going to say, hey, I can work remotely, my kids can go to other schools or do school remotely, and I don't need to have this expensive, dense, less room in lifestyle. What do we think?
I'll take this first. So you've quoted Paul Romer inadvertently several times, a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. And of course, he won the Nobel Prize last year for basically mathematically proving out what makes cities so special, those knowledge spillovers in dense areas. So I think that'll continue. I think corporations, and I'll call this now, I think Facebook and others who basically abandoned physical proximity altogether will pay for it in the long run. They will suffer a decay of their cultures, they'll have increasing turnover, and will gradually lose the ability to innovate. I keep thinking of the CEO of Hewlett Packard in '97 who said, if HP knew what HP knows, we'd be 3 times more productive. I think that those organizations will fall into that trap. So I would continue on that, and I would continue to bet on cities for those reasons. These nuclear reactors of social networks that produce this heat and light in the form of wages and innovation, things like that. The one thing I'd like to add on top of that, and I'll hand it over to Daniel, is one thing that I hope does come out of the crisis is that the road not taken over a decade ago when it came to our various technologies here was the so-called sharing economy. There ended up not being a lot of sharing in the sharing economy. There was a lot of renting of assets. And I've been following closely in this, the rise of these mutual aid networks, right, of neighbors helping neighbors. And we've seen this in previous disasters. Occupy Sandy was an example after the hurricane, where volunteers formed together using all sorts of open source tools. And we're seeing that now happen nationwide and worldwide. And people are realizing that there are disadvantaged and marginalized people all around them that they could aid. And so it's been interesting watching responses of this. We've seen in Montreal here, for example, where I live, the city has created its own electric bike delivery platform available at cost to local businesses. So there you have municipal innovation and provision. And then we've seen the rise, there's a new platform called Neighbor Express, created by Jen Palka of Code for America and a team of software engineers. Open source, available for free to cities so that volunteers can deliver goods and services for their neighbors. And so what I hope we'll see as part of this trend is not just, the public-private dichotomy anymore, but maybe now we can sort of go back to that fork we didn't take and explore this whole new realm of, of citizen engagement and true sharing, and sort of explore that out of the crisis.
Great, thank you, Greg. Daniel?
So it looks like I only have about 30 seconds or a minute. I'll say I'll keep it very brief. I think I'm like Greg, I'm also quite bullish about the future of cities. I do think also we tend to think about these crises when we're in the midst of them and forget that people tend to have short memories later on. So I think we shouldn't overestimate. I don't know that human behavior is fundamentally going to change. I do think that what crises like this tend to do is accelerate things that were already going on, you know, in the background. So there's already some movement towards more remote work, as you call, was not always a disaster. So I think things like that, e-learning and so forth, those will accelerate. I agree with that. I don't think it's going to become a dramatic 0 to 1 sort of shift, but they will accelerate. And I hope, obviously, from our side, similarly, technology and transportation, adoption of that, which is one of the sectors that has adopted technology the least by a mile. My hope is that that adoption accelerate.
Well, I'm glad it didn't happen sooner, Daniel. We started to lose your audio a little bit at the end there, but we heard most of what you said, and it's a perfect moment for me to pause and say thank you to both of you for joining us. Really rich.
I finished with just which is very
just about the future of cities and transportation. So with that, I think we're going to wrap up. Thank you, everybody, for attending. For our corporate network members, we'll see you in our executive session now on the other Zoom link. To Daniel and Greg, thank you both, and good luck in the ventures you're pursuing and the good work you're doing to make cities better places to live. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Andrew. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, guys.